Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'll be your host for the next 60 exciting minutes. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Each and every day almost brings news of new government corruption. And now it's been reported that NatWest Bank is refusing to pay some of the government bills because of lack of due diligence. In other words, they're probably concerned that they're going to pay somebody who subsequently finds himself engaged in some dubious activity. Pretty serious stuff. And at eye-watering, if you haven't registered this, an eye-watering £280 million was awarded to a hedge fund and a pest control firm. Neither had any experience whatsoever in the products that they guaranteed to supply, but they did have government connections. Guess what? The masks they made were unfit for purpose. £280 million, and the product was not fit for use. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to an eminent professor, David Edgerton, and we will be talking about David's book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, and how he sees the future of England and the UK generally, and so much more besides. And as always, we take your questions live. So now's your chance. Send in your question. You'll find all the details on the What's On guide. Go there, submit your questions, and we'll try and answer as many as we can as we go through the show. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So very much, this is your show. We look forward to your questions and comments. Now, to our guest. Tonight, The Nation talks to David Edgerton. How are you, David?
I'm very well, thank you.
How has the pandemic affected you?
Well, luckily, none of my family have suffered from COVID, none of my friends. I haven't had to go out to work on the buses or clean the streets or to work in a hospital. I've been working from home. So it has not been too bad.
Good, good. Tell us a little bit about David Edgerton. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Your family?
Well, I was born in Montevideo in Uruguay. And my father was a Londoner, a chemist, and he ran a photographic manufacturing company there. My mother was Argentine. So I'm rather a hybrid. And I lived in Uruguay and then Argentina until I was 11. Came to England then and went to school here and to university as well. And I've been here ever since.
And you went from university to university as a student. Then you moved to. How did that work?
That's right. I did a PhD, and before I finished, I went to teach at the University of Manchester to teach the economics of science and technology. I recall that was 1984, a long time ago. Well, it was a very interesting moment. It was the autumn term of 1984, so we were in the middle of the miners' strike. And at that time, I lived in Liverpool while I was looking for a place in Manchester. I lived in Everton in a tower block that was mostly empty. It's freezing cold. It's a freezing winter, and Liverpool was a place in decline. It was a mess. I remember there was a police guard on the chip shop around the corner from us, because the local lads were nicking the Savaloids. But it's interesting to think back to that time, how rough things were in England.
It sounds tough. It sounds tough. Could you move your mic a little bit closer to your mouth?
I think so. Yes, there we are. Is that better?
That's much better. That's much better. So from Manchester, you went where?
I spent something like 8 years in Manchester, and then returned to London in the early 90s to Imperial College, where we set up a centre for the history of science, technology, and medicine. And I was running that for a long time, and we transferred it to King's College London in 2013, which is where I now I am teaching the history of technology, the history of science, as well as British history.
So, talking about British history, tell us a little bit about your book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation.
Well, I wrote the book because I was rather dissatisfied with most of our accounts of British history, which focus very much on Westminster, a little bit on Whitehall. It focuses on the kind of surface of politics. And I wanted to write a history of the United Kingdom of the sort that a British historian might write about Germany or the Soviet Union or France. That's to say, a history that took seriously the army, business, the economy, the dark side as well as the bright side. And to get rid, essentially, of the dreadful sentimentalism that's such a feature of most British history.
And what was your take? I mean, I gather that you dispute the rather common perception that Britain was languishing, the poor man of Europe, until Margaret Thatcher came along and got rid of all these inefficiencies, and the place has never looked back. You don't accept that, do you?
I don't, for two reasons. The first is that the British decline that Margaret Thatcher and so many others talked about wasn't quite as was described. That's to say, the UK was the richest economy in Europe into the 1950s. I mean, it wasn't on its uppers by the late 19th century, as so many of these declinist historians suggested. And the second reason is that the belief that Margaret Thatcher turned a declining nation into a revived one, which is so central to Conservative Party politics, so central indeed to the whole Brexit argument, is false. The UK is still poorer relative to Germany or France, and indeed to the same degree that it was in 1979. The difference is that the UK is now much more unequal than it was in 1979. There are parts of the UK which are poorer per capita than East Germany. So I certainly don't see the Thatcher era and the era that's followed it as one of success. It has been a success for certain parts of the country, above all London. It has been a success for a significant proportion of the population, the better off. But for the country, or the countries as a whole, it is not been a great success. And I think it's extraordinary, in fact.
Is your sense that the cake, as it were, the national economic cake, is the same size as it was, but it's just that some people have got bigger slices and others have got almost nothing at all?
Well, it's bigger than it was in 1979, but the rate at which it's got bigger since 1979 is lower than the rate at which the cake got bigger between 1945 and 1979. So we were doing better in terms of economic growth before Thatcher than after Thatcher. I know people find that very hard to believe, but it is the case. In terms of the shares of the cake, in the years after the Second World War, the cake began to be shared a little bit more equally. But since 1979, we've gone back to a very unequal sharing of that cake.
Yes, I was struck. Perhaps I ought not to have been too surprised. I watched a Vox Pop with somebody who'd voted, a Labour voter who'd voted Conservative at the Hartlepool by-election recently. And he was asked, do you find Boris Johnson appealing? Is that why you voted Conservative? Why you changed? And he said, well, he's made a lot of things happen. He said, you know, up until quite recently, we had no food banks. Now we've got 12. I thought it was a joke.
Yes.
At least I like to think it was a joke, but I'm not so sure now. Do you think that how economically literate do you think people are here when it comes to judging these big economic questions?
Well, I don't think we should expect people to be economically literate. After all, the economy is a very complex thing. And it is difficult to understand that the budget of the nation is not the same as the budget of a household. It is difficult to understand how the different parts of the material economy interrelate with each other. So I don't blame people for not being economically literate, but I do want to say, and one has to say, that governments are increasingly inclined to be, well, shall we say, less than truthful about the economy. Brexit is a very good example of that. All sorts of claims were made about new economic arrangements, which turned out to be just quite untrue, and the claims were not made out of ignorance. They were made out of certain kind of political necessity, in the knowledge that they were true. So I think that's the key feature of our time.
That would suggest that we rather depend a great deal on the media helping people to understand better these big questions. How good a job do you think the mainstream media made during the Brexit referendum?
I think it did a very poor job. I think it didn't explain the realities. It didn't explain the case for Brexit. It didn't explain the case against Brexit. I mean, there is a case for Brexit, but it's not the case that was made. The case that was made was a fantasy case. It was a suggestion that essentially everything would stay the same, except for the bits we didn't like, which would get better, and that was never an option on the cards. I mean, you could say that there were some positive arguments for Brexit. And for example, the European Union is rather protective towards agriculture. You could go back to the situation in the UK before 1914, when food came in freely from the rest of the world, made food in the UK much cheaper than anywhere in Europe. But that argument wasn't made. Why? Because it implied the destruction of much of British agriculture.
Yeah, and that certainly seems to be the case. We hear daily. I could have, in my preamble, mentioned how furious the hill farmers are at this measure to allow tariff-free import of Australian foodstuffs.
That's right, and it's a very important move, and I think it is a crunch moment for Brexit, because the Brexiters, I mean, contrary to the image that they projected, are radical free traders. So they do want free trade. They do want the country flooded with Australian beef and New Zealand lamb and beef from the River Plate. Of course they do, and they rightly see actually that was an immense source of strength for the United Kingdom before 1914. But they don't want to admit that the consequence of this is the return of British sheep population to what it was in 1914, which is much lower than it is today. Same with the beef herd. So they pretend that free trade implies that the British food producers will have larger markets overseas. British hill farmers obviously not going to compete with lowland New Zealand sheep farmers. It's a nonsense, and they know it's a nonsense.
You mentioned earlier that a nation's economy is not at all like a household economy and shouldn't be treated the same. I mean, what's your view on modern monetary theory?
Oh, I am not going to dig a hole for myself, but I will say this, that the argument that that we are potentially destroying ourselves by indebting the state to the extent we are at the moment is quite untrue, because we're effectively lending ourselves money. I mean, government debt is somebody's savings. I'm very happy that we collectively are saving money by very securely by lending it to the government, and the government is spending it to keeping us all clothed and fed and in work.
That sounds a little bit like modern monetary theory, though.
I suspect there is a connection. Yes.
Because these folks maintain that government, as long as you have a sovereign, as long as you own your own bank, as it were, as a country, you have the flexibility to be able to print. Of course, you always risk inflation, but to a degree, you can literally print money with the press of a button and use that money for whatever purposes you require.
That's right, and I think what the COVID crisis has taught us, and indeed the financial crisis, is that governments can do an awful lot to keep economies going. The idea that we are actually living in a world of free markets which are self-balancing is obviously a nonsense. I mean, governments have interfered in the economy in the last decade or so in a way which would be regarded as deeply illegitimate 10 years before. So we are living, actually, interestingly, in a world of possibility, and that's what worries many people. To say that once it becomes clear that governments can do all sorts of different things, it becomes difficult to say no to. And but I say I think it's a great opportunity to collectively do things that we want to do, and that's why we need to reject the argument that all this debt is something that needs to be paid back through a new dose of austerity in the next decade.
Would you go so far as to say that austerity is a chimera? It's a myth.
Well, austerity from 2010 is a bit of a myth in that it didn't apply to everybody. The government was very selective in who it took money from. It took money from local authorities. It took money from certain functions and left others with same sort of levels of money it had before. Health being a case in point, pensions being another. In fact, one of the most interesting features of the recent past is that the Conservatives, in particular, have followed a politics of supporting the old, and it's no accident that the old have quite disproportionately supported them in general elections. And interestingly, the old have been the people who voted for Brexit, and the young of not just Scotland but also England were against Brexit and vote Labour. So we mustn't get the impression that the United Kingdom is at all well represented by the likes of Boris Johnson or the kind of politics that he's associated with. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. We have a very particular electoral system which gives a majority to parties. This is in the United Kingdom and in local elections in England, at least, that gives a party would say 40% of the popular vote a massive majority, ability to do whatever it likes.
Yeah, I mean it is interesting. James Reith is asking a question. He says, "I've always likened Boris to Emperor Nero, and Britain as Rome burning." How much of that do you agree with?
Well, Britain is burning. I think it is, in the sense that it doesn't have really anywhere to go, and Boris is having a very jolly time, having his flat done up and enjoying being being prime minister and enjoying the discomfort of the opposition. We shouldn't underrate him as a politician, but he and his party are not actually interested in rejuvenating the British economy. It's a very different kind of politics that they're interested in.
Charles Smith is asking, have you a view on powerful financial organizations and people influencing the democratic process?
Yes, I think it'd be most people's view, which is that on the whole, it's a bad thing. And I think it's very striking that that in the discussions around British politics, the nature of the funding of the political system have become so prominent. There are all sorts of questions being asked about the funding of the pro-Brexit campaigns, and indeed all sorts of questions asked about the funding of the Conservative Party. And I don't just mean Boris Johnson's home decorations.
We have a question from Jim McIntyre, which I'm not sure I quite follow, but he's saying, can David give us a quick spiel, he says, on J.C. Maxwell?
Oh, James Clerk Maxwell, yes. Yes. He taught at King's College, in fact, and he's the creator of electromagnetic theory. I mean, one of the greatest Scottish scientists of the 19th century, without question. Indeed, as well as the creator of modern electromagnetic theory, he is also the creator of color photography. He demonstrated color photography. So he's one of the great geniuses of 19th century science, without question.
Wasn't it Einstein who said he owed so much to Clerk Maxwell?
I don't know for certain, but it's very, very likely indeed, yes.
So I guess, like most of the people watching and listening, you're very clear that austerity is not what it sets out to be or presents itself. It's specially directed at particular groups and leaves others alone, as it were. How much of that featured in your book? Was that a central part of your book, or did you touch upon that from time to time in the course of it?
I mean, that wasn't a central part of the book. My book essentially ends in 2003 with the Iraq War. So I don't talk about that sort of austerity. But I certainly do talk about economic policy right across the 20th century, and indeed the nature of the welfare state, which is often misunderstood. I mean, the UK has never had a very generous welfare state, certainly not by comparison with continental Europe after 1945. The idea that the UK has spent too much on welfare is one of the many myths about British history that are sought to dispel.
So why is it that, because in so much of what you've said, you tackle the myths, but the overall question is, how do these myths, how are they arrived at, and why do they have such sustainability? I mean, is it because they don't get questioned or challenged? What is it that causes these myths to become so deeply embedded, do you think?
Well, because they're useful to somebody. So it was a very good story to tell about Britain, that it went from being a place of poverty to becoming a welfare state after 1945. It was celebrated as a great triumph. And once that story is established, then it becomes a story that people can attack. So you can say, well, it was look, we all agree it was a welfare state, but actually I'm now going to tell you that was a bad thing rather than a good. So it's myths have their uses, and they become the fabric of political and other sorts of debates. Yeah. We have certain myths about the Second World War, for example, that suit a lot of people.
What sort of myths?
Well, the myth of the weak nation that suddenly finds its mojo in 1940 with Winston Churchill. That's a story about the difference between the politics we've had from 1940 compared to the politics that went before. It's useful for the Conservative Party because it can centre itself on the figure of Winston Churchill, who was, of course, kept out of government by Conservatives in the 1930s. It's useful for Labour because it can point to the moment when it becomes part of the political infrastructure of the nation. It can argue that it is the creator of modern Britain through its alleged creation of the welfare state. So these are very powerful stories that are told. Indeed, 1940 is the great creation myth of modern Britain. That's the moment in which not just the politics of the subsequent 4 or 5 decades were set, but the nature of society, the nature of its ideology. I mean, sometimes said that 1940 was the moment when the UK ceased being imperial and became a nation. And so we tell stories of the Second World War, at least we used to tell stories of the Second World War, that had no empire at all. That was the context in which people said and say in the history books that something called Britain stood alone. Now, the King Emperor or the British Prime Minister or the Archbishop of Canterbury could never have said that Britain is standing alone in 1940. They'd have been shouted off the stage because if anything was standing alone, it was the British Empire, of course. It could not have been something called Britain. It had to be the empire. But in fact, the great emphasis in propaganda was not on the empire being alone. It's actually the empire in alliance with other countries. And first, of course, the French Republic until the end of June 1940. But then the Dutch Empire, the Belgian Empire, Greeks, the Norwegians, and so on. So even rhetorically, in 1940-41, the British Empire was not alone.
So I find this fascinating because the opposite, i.e., the nation stood alone, it is almost embedded in Holy Writ now. I mean, anyone who says what you've just said, it would be regarded as somewhat eccentric because...
yes, and worse than eccentric, actually dangerous and mad, actually. But that's because we've been brought up with those stories from the 60s and 70s. It would have been regarded as eccentric to say Britain stood alone in 1940. I mean, one thing we forget is the importance of a sense of there being a British Empire before 1945. It was absolutely fundamental to conservative politics. And within that empire, one could be Australian, Canadian, Scottish, Irish, English. So these, as it were, national identities coexisted with an imperial identity. But after 1945, the way I see it, you get the creation of a powerful British identity, a non-imperial British identity. So just something quite new and something which, in fact, has not lasted very long.
It's interesting, isn't it? We have a couple of 3 questions here. Robert Knight is suggesting that he gathers from today's news on farming that it rather sounds as if in the short term, 5 years, we'll probably have to wave goodbye to both our farming and fishing industry. What's your take on that?
Yes, I think that's quite possible. That's, I think, the broad direction in which the Brexiters, meaning here the people pushing it, the ideologues, have wanted to take the country. And as I was saying a minute ago, it makes a certain sense. Why grow food here when you can import it? I mean, that was the argument that the Edwardians made, the Edwardian liberals made, that the United Kingdom was better off than Germany because it didn't have to grow its own food. That's why British people ate more beef, ate lamb, ate white bread, not brown bread. Why they could work in factories rather than working on the land. So there was certainly a very powerful argument for reducing the size of the British farming sector back then. I think the argument today is a much weaker one, and in any case is really an argument about food standards, animal welfare, and all these questions.
Are you thinking now about chlorinated chicken?
Yes, and it's not just chlorinated chicken. It's a whole system of intensive agriculture that, of course, produces food more cheaply. And it's important to remember that places like the United States and Australia and New Zealand are not looking to export steel or iPhones or motor cars. Really, the only thing they have to export are food products. So this is why it's so important. So any free trade deal those countries will sign will involve opening up the British economy to their agricultural products. No question about
it. And what do you think the medium and long term effect of that will be?
Well, a reduction in the agricultural output and the agricultural population. Of course, the case of fishing, of course, is different because the big effect there has been the closing off of European markets to British fishers, and that is just the result of the kind of Brexit that the British government wanted. So there's a paradox that this free trading government has actually reduced the extent of free trade because they don't like European free trade, but they like their fantasy global free trade.
I mean, it's terribly worrying, I have to say. Steve Webster is asking, can you say something about the long-term value of the pound against the US dollar and the euro?
No, I'm afraid not. I have no idea, except that that money markets obey their own logic, and it's a logic that I say.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to go there either, I have to be honest with you. It could have been more arcane. He could have asked about Bitcoin and all the rest. Charles Smith is saying, do you see any advantages in the UK creating a proper constitution, i.e. written and codified?
For the UK, yes, I think it would be a good thing because, not because I think there's anything magical about a written constitution, but because it would be an opportunity to think about the way we are currently ruled, and to decide perhaps to be ruled in a different, a better way, a more democratic way. I think the problem with the unwritten constitution is that people don't understand what it actually is. But the British Constitution it exists, and it's a powerful thing. And to give you an instance, just the other day, the cabinet secretary effectively saying that you couldn't change the arrangement by which the prime minister was the ultimate authority on ministerial code and whether it had been broken or not, because in the British system of government, the ministers were appointed, the prime minister, by the monarch on the advice of the prime minister. So that had to be where authority lay. Otherwise, the whole logic of the system would break down. Now, we could have a different system in which the prime minister was obliged to follow the ministerial, and that decisions as to whether he or she had done so reside in some properly constituted separate authority, or that's potentially open.
Yeah, we have a saying on this show that the British Constitution is whatever the government of the day with a working majority says it is.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that, and certainly that's what we need to understand, that the British governments have extraordinary power, and it's not as a power that's given to them by the democratically elected Parliament. We have a government that governs and can only be restrained by the Parliament. But of course, in most cases, the government completely controls Parliament, so it isn't much of a restraint. But there's a very big difference in the United States, where, for example, Congress determines budgets. I mean, here governments determine budgets and just push them through Parliament. Very different arrangement.
I want to take you on, if I may, to your discussion with the European Conversations podcast, and you say that that English politics are in the midst of a profound crisis, and that a breakup of the UK is what the country needs. Could you expand on that?
Yes. Why are we in a profound crisis? Well, I think we have a serious disconnection between our politics and the kind of realities of the economy and society. If you ask the question, what did people in work knew about the world of work, economy, vote for? They voted against Brexit, and yet you have a Brexit forced upon us. Our politics has ceased to be as truthful as it was. We have a politics of systematic mendacity, and that's new. I mean, once upon a time, if you were listening to parliamentary debate or reading Hansard, you'd see a serious discussion on points of substance between government and opposition. I mean, today most parliamentary speeches are unbearable, because you know that there is one lack of frankness followed by another. This is deeply destructive of serious conversation as where the nation might go. We've seen that the prorogation of Parliament for completely political purposes, that's never happened, at least in the recent past. So yes, we are, I think, in a serious political crisis. I think we're also in a crisis due to the kind of lack of decent information being given by the television and by the newspapers. We're living in a. I mean, it's not true to say we're living in a world of sound bites or a 24-hour news cycle. That's not the problem. We're living in a world where it's assumed that people don't understand, don't care, and can be repeatedly told untruths. And that's what happens. I mean, but people aren't stupid. They understand that they've been told untruths and switch off, of course. So these are all very, very serious matters.
You also said in that podcast that you believe the four nations of the UK would benefit from a new democratic settlement. and that England needs to have a crisis of authority before it can move forward. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I think one of the most interesting things about the Scottish case and the Welsh case is that certainly Scotland, sees itself essentially as it is, as a nation that is the size of, say, Norway, that has certain potentialities, but it doesn't see itself as a small United States. It doesn't see itself as a global power. It doesn't see itself as a nation which is superior in every way to our European neighbours. So I think what England needs is for its political culture to reflect England's true place in the world. At the moment, we are living with an image of England which is just fantastical. And I think one way to get us to understand reality is if Scots say, look, we've had enough of being ruled by these fantasists. We want to go our own. And my hope is that in those circumstances, that bit of England that is deluded, because I insist most English people are not deluded, will change their minds. We'll be able to develop a more democratic politics, and indeed through that to establish a new comradely relationship with Scotland. As to say, I'm not for separation of England and Scotland. I want a union isn't the word, but a coming together on much better terms than currently exists. As I say, I think it'd be good for Scotland, and it would also be good for England.
So I understand this better. Are you suggesting some sort of Scandinavian arrangement where Norway, Sweden, and Denmark are all sovereign entities, but they cooperate? They have their own collective airline. They have all sorts of other cooperations between the component parts, but they are sovereign each. But they collaborate because it makes sense to collaborate. Is that your sense of it?
Oh, it could be. I personally wouldn't rule out a new union. I mean, if England and Scotland, as sovereign states, decided to come together again, as in 1707, I think that would be fantastic. But of course, it would have to be a union that was agreeable to both parties. And I think it would be, and this is the point, a radically different union to the one we have at the moment. Yeah. Radically different, not just for Scotland, but also crucially for England.
Can we talk about England for a second, please? You say that if there were to be Scottish independence, or whatever you want to call it, that would be good for England, perhaps. What basis do you have for saying that? Why do you maintain that?
Because I think the delusion that England through Great Britain is a great power has been deeply damaging to our politics, to our society. It's essentially that. We need an understanding that England is not so different in reality from other parts of Europe. That there is a democratic deficit in England that needs to be addressed. That we need a new politics of national reconstruction in England that is currently impossible to achieve. So that's what I mean. That there is a particular set of reflexes and positions which follow from a delusional view of Britain's place or England, Anglo-centric account of the United Kingdom's place in the world.
I think a lot of people in the audience would probably agree with you. What they would find difficult to figure out is where the appetite is for the sort of changes that you suggest might come about. I mean, for example, in Scotland, we very often hear about a federal state. Gordon Brown's favourite pet subject is to talk about a federal or quasi-federal state. But I detect no appetite anywhere else for anything remotely like that.
No, that's right. I agree with you, and I think that's a very serious problem. Clearly, the Conservative Party is not offering that, nor is the Labour Party actually, and find it very difficult to do so. So no, I absolutely would agree with that, and that's why I, in essence, think that I mean, Scotland just needs to make its own way, and if you like, Scotland wants a federal system, I think it probably needs to become independent first, and then enter into that federation. But having said that, I say I do recognise that the British state, the British political system, the English-centred British political system, is deeply conservative. It is stuck in certain formulas that have now reached an absurd stage. But these positions are not shared by a large proportion of the population. And that's where I see the hope. I think there is a radical disconnect between actually both parties now, and the thinking of a very significant part of the population, essentially the young, essentially the under 55s, the under 60s. They are on a different planet. They are not wanting to run up Union Jacks on every public building. They're not the ones fantasizing about selling Melton Mowbray pies to the United States, or bringing down the tariff for Scotch whisky in India. These are people who see themselves as Europeans, not just as Europeans, as people like many other people in the world who don't have this ludicrous recently developed sense of the English as a world historical people with unique traits. I mean, all this talk about being science superpower, reactivating the kind of China station with aircraft carriers and frigates is risible. I mean, nobody takes it seriously. And in the world outside the UK, you don't have prime ministers and presidents kind of doffing their caps to Boris Johnson and thinking, "Wow, I wish we could have his dynamism and courage." They're saying, "Good Lord, once upon a time we rather looked up to the British prime ministers. They were men, and this applies also to Margaret Thatcher. They were people of substance. They were honest, perhaps unlike our politicians. They were trustworthy. You could count on an Englishman and perhaps a Scotsman's word too. This is the way it would be put, wouldn't it? Nowadays, I mean, no serious politician anywhere in the world would think of the British political class in that. I mean, the idea of Westminster being a model for it's just a joke, isn't it? And the Scots have obviously moved on very, very radically from that, and I think to the great benefit of Scotland. But I think that the British structure as it now stands could come tumbling down very, very. The British English structure.
I'm still not clear in my own mind how that's going to happen, because you just said a couple of minutes ago that neither of the two major parties want to see radical constitutional change.
Mm-hmm.
But the young people perhaps do. How do they articulate, if they can't do it through the two main parties. How do they articulate that desire for change?
Well, the votes of the currently young will become more important with time. I think the Tory party is actually in the long term in a weak position because it's tied itself to a demographic that's dying off. It's tied itself to a policy Brexit that's going to fail. I don't think they've got anywhere to go. So I think the wheels will begin to come off that. And I think a way to accelerate that would be for Scotland to achieve independence.
Historically, the precedents are not good when people lose confidence in the democratic process.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to go for extremes rather than saying, well, let's have a more enlightened administration. They tend to say, here's a populist. He stroke she, less commonly she, sounds good to me.
Yes.
Well, isn't that a concern?
It most certainly is a concern. And I'd say to you, that's exactly what's happened. It's not something we should worry about for the future. We should worry that this is exactly where we are now. That our politics has been a politics based on a rejection of the political system. The Brexit vote was an outpouring of discontent with the politics of the United Kingdom. And the great genius of the Brexiters was to direct the ire of many people against Brussels rather than against London, and rather than against the Conservative Party. It really was a stroke of genius to blame Brussels for decisions taken in London. A stroke of genius to claim there's a democratic deficit in Brussels when the most important one was in London. And we have a government that is deeply authoritative. It's out to effect cultural change. We see that in its insistence on flying the flag. I mean, the most un-British thing. I told you earlier that my father was born in London, and like a good Englishman of his era, he looked down on nations that had to put the flag up every morning and sing the national anthem. That was not something anyone British would think of doing. But that's the kind of, we have a kind of tin pot nationalism of a sort that British people used to despise here at home. We have a politics of rewriting history to suit the fantasy visions of a Conservative Party, a politics of directing museums to tell particular sorts of national stories. We have a politics of criticizing supposed metropolitan elites for not having the same prejudices as a proper English person should. I mean, this is dangerous politics, but it's here.
I mean, it is deeply worrying, isn't it, when you explain it in those terms? I mean, it seems to me there's a bunch of our questioners are concerned about Westminster diverting government money to red wall constituencies and adjusting the vote that way. But I want to just more or less confirm what you just said. One of our guests on a previous show remarked that 60% of men in the UK could identify the silhouette of a Spitfire. No one in Germany could identify the silhouette of a Messerschmitt.
Yes, that's interesting and rings true. and the obsession with World War II, or at least with particular versions of World War II, where the Spitfire is central, is a very extraordinary thing.
If we're almost at, well, we got about 5 minutes to go. Are there any particular messages you'd like to leave with us, David? Any particular themes or any particular comments that might summarize or encapsulate your view of looking forward now? Where do you think we're going to be in the medium to long term? Yeah.
Well, I think the message is that we are living in a world of possibilities, and both the financial crisis and COVID demonstrate that. That's not to say that the financial crisis and COVID would of themselves make a better world. In fact, they both made a worse world. But they open up the possibility to change things. And I think that's what we need. Yeah. And if we are to go back to the past, we could choose to go back to the years from 1945. And that was the great theme then, is that collectively we could decide to improve the world. And people could legitimately believe that health systems would become better, that education would become better, standard of living would become better, that our children would have better lives than we had. And I think it is possible to recapture that sense. But to make all that come true, and it requires, I think, a new politics, a new commitment to the future, which is possible, though that is not the direction we're currently.
So how would this, speculate for a second, how would this new politics come about? Who would be the drivers? What would be the drive? We know what the drivers might be, but who might the drivers be? Who can you look to right now and say, that's somebody who will take us in that direction?
You put your finger on the problem, but things change in politics. Things change sometimes very, very, very quickly. I mean, who'd have thought that Scotland would not essentially have a Labour Party or a Conservative Party from the perspective of 1950? We had UK-wide political parties for decades and decades, and they seemed immovable. They've gone from Scotland. Well, they're still there, but they are much less powerful than they were. So yes, things can change, and as I say, I mean things are not presently going in the right direction. We have to hope, and we should that things will change, that new forces will emerge.
We have a question here. Somebody says, if David were living in Scotland, would he vote for Scottish independence?
Yes, I would.
You would?
I would.
Unequivocally.
Yes.
Because you would see it as a way of unshackling England to face a different future.
Well, first of all, unshackling Scotland, but also unshackling England. Yes. Exactly.
And
as I say, not because I think I don't mean unshackling Scotland from England or England from Scotland. I mean is unshackling both England and Scotland from the current arrangements that rule us both. That's the point.
So, assuming everything worked out the way you would hope, i.e. that people would realise a change in direction were necessary, what sort of time frame? This is really taxing now, and I apologise for asking it, but I have to ask it. What sort of time frame would you attach to that process?
Oh, I don't know, but it could be a decade. It could be less.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Who knows?
Yeah. If you go back to the Scottish example, it probably took about couple of maybe 2 decades. But then there was an SNP, so there was a focus.
Yes.
You could trace that narrative very straightforwardly. I'm still finding difficulty getting that focus. I'm looking to England. Where is that focus? I'm trying to find it right now, and I just don't see it.
No, you're not wrong, but at the level of political parties. But there are people discussing the need for a new democratic England, for sure. And certainly people are talking about redefining Englishness.
Good.
So that is definitely there. Yeah.
Excellent. That's very good. Thank you, David. Our allotted time is over, I'm afraid. I did say it would go fast, and
yes, indeed.
It generally does.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again. And let me just say, by way of rounding up, in addition to a big thank you to David, a big thank you to all of you out there watching and listening. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. If you want to see who's on, simply go to the Indie Live, www.whatsonguide.scot, and you'll see them all listed there. I can tell you, so you don't have to look for next week's guest, it is Dr. Malcolm Petrie from St Andrews University. And Malcolm is an expert on 20th century Scottish history. So join us next week. And now's the time to get your questions in ahead of that, so you can make sure that your question gets addressed during the show. And please, another reminder, look out for the Constitution column in the Sunday National. This week it's written by my colleague, Dr. Elliot Bulmer, and he'll be discussing whether it's time to junk the D'Hondt system. In other words, should we be looking more at STV and less at D'Hondt? I know this sounds terribly technical, but I know many of you have been concerned about the fact that some of the minor parties in Scotland you might feel are overrepresented. Elliot would take issue with that. He feels a proportional system is as proportional as you can get it. No system is perfect, but read his column on Sunday for more details, please. Oh, and very importantly, support Indie Live Radio. And the way you can do that, particularly if you've enjoyed the show tonight as much as I have, there is a crowdfunder running right now. Again, you'll find all the details on the What's On guide. Help run the media. If you don't like the mainstream media, you have an alternative, and it's right here, right in front of you, but it needs your support. Please give it that support. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks again. Join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Goodbye, everyone.